So this is talking about the way life can be undermined by unrestrained, too much freedom that breaks out of every single barrier that exists, kind of, and how tremendous freedom exists within any given set of bounds. And that particularly because we are finite organic beings, and because the earth is a finite organic resource, the effort to have total liberty, total freedom, absolute, is unrealistic and actually damaging, not only to other people's lives and the lives of the living organic world we live in, but even to ourselves. You know, too much of anything can be damaging to our health, our psychological, physical health, our relationships, whatever. So this is exploring that realm of restrained liberty. So the idea of flourishing of life, phrases like passionate, free, self-organized, expression and relationship, these are all dimensions of flourishing life. And we want that. We want to have the ability to be passionately engaged, to be free of constraints, to be self-organized, not have anyone or anything telling us what to do, be able to express ourselves, be able to connect to whomever and whatever we want. That's what quality of life is largely all about. So we want to have that. We want to have flourishing life in ourselves and other people, in our communities, in nature. It's just, that's almost one of the definitions of what we want. And also the passion that people have for things causes them to have a lot of knowledge about and experience with that particular realm. And that's a source for, in the context of other people, for gathering the bigger picture. All of our passions together, all of our life experience together adds up to something that's bigger than any of us, and that can inform what we do, how we think, what we decide. And our freedom is necessary to manifest, to bring that out. We don't want to be boxed in, oppressed, whatever, because that silences all that juicy diversity that can inform our inquiry into what would be wise. And the self-organized, to have people and perspectives and factors be able to move in relationship to each other all the time, provides a juicy soup, which, if we address it and engage with it appropriately, will generate wisdom. So this is both what we want and a large part of how we're able to get it. But once we start talking about freedom, there is this longing and impulse and political ideology of maximizing our freedom. And that can get in the way. It's like one of the old sayings is, your freedom to fling your arm around ends where my nose begins. It's one of the ways to describe the limits of freedom. My father, in an article on social power and a democracy, talks about the stoplight as an interesting example. If you don't have any stoplight, then everybody has to stop. And if you don't have any stoplight and there's a country road coming into a major thoroughfare, a major highway, then the person who's on the country road may have to wait for hours to get enough space to get into the flow of traffic. So like the stoplight as an example, you can optimize everyone's freedom. Like if there's a major highway and a little side road, then it's maybe every 5 minutes you have the light briefly changes to allow one or two cars to get out into the traffic, and then returns to legitimizing the motion of most of the people on the highway, which has very small, a small limit on the freedom of the people in the main highway and a gigantic increase in the freedom of a few people on the side. That's an example of an attempt to optimize freedom rather than, you actually can't maximize freedom for everybody. So there's also the sense that there are constraints that are life diminishing, that reduce the aliveness of the system. There's constraints that increase the aliveness within the system. There's a funny way in which sports are great examples. The rules of the game in sports and games is a space within which to express ourselves and manifest our capacities. And if you don't have those rules there, it sort of becomes this chaotic mess that doesn't have any structure to it, and you actually can become less free, you can express yourself less well. So in our wise democracy, we are trying to, in any given circumstance, we're trying to figure out what are the most life-serving constraints. How do we relate to the given constraints of, the ecosystem or the society? There's certain constraints that are sort of given. Reality has constraints. But we want to figure out how to set up our relationship to those constraints and identify those constraints in a way that actually serve life rather than limit it. And of course, that includes giving permission for some people to test the edges, test the limits. It's important, even in a well-ordered society, to have people who are objecting to any limits. And those are the leading edge fringes that test what might come next. So that the libertines, the people who are blowing apart all the moral and legal and socially conceived boundaries, are important parts of a society to maintain its creativity. The modern art abstractionism, whatever, is blowing apart established forms of art. And some of it is kind of ridiculous, and some of it is, kicking a door open into some wild and very interesting creativity. So that dance is something. What serves life, even though one, it's like we celebrate sometimes brilliant criminals. We wouldn't want to be affected by their crimes, but the fact that they are stepping out so successfully out of bounds of what the society has given inspires us to step out of some of the bounds that society has placed on us. But ultimately, we have reality. We have the limits of the ecosystem, the reality of gravity, the reality of we are, running out of certain resources, etc. And it's like within that, within the fact that we are running out of our fossil fuels and that they're destroying our environment, there's gigantic space for creativity, for entrepreneurship, for reducing unnecessary waste. So that's a life-serving constraint if we frame it that way. And the reason character is in here is because society can say, okay, we're going to make a law here, and people object to laws. But laws are there where individual and organizational character, moral sensibility, integrity, do not handle the area that needs to be constrained. If we can constrain ourselves, we don't need laws to constrain us. So part of social life is, raising children and creating social answerability systems, and the rest to build and socially contain character development, so that we don't need so many laws all the time. So that would be part of a wise democracy also, is let's co-create a society that builds strong, responsible character that can relate to reality in sensible ways and sees opportunities to manifest our lives within constraints that we recognize collectively are necessary for us, and that we create and support the minimal constraints, social constraints and laws that are needed to make sense. One of the, obvious ones at a societal level is regulations. Again, to the extent people and, individuals and companies, organizations, whatever, are responsible, are environmentally responsible, you don't need environmental regulations. To the extent, people are responsible with their guns, you don't need gun control. It's like, but people aren't, corporations aren't. The social system that we have developed supports profit making above social and environmental responsibility. So we need to have environmental laws that will enable people to be more green without losing market share, because everybody has to be more green to follow the laws. So that's the regulatory scene can level the playing field for all players at a higher level of responsibility, which again is not necessary to do if everybody's willing to self-manage in responsible ways. A carbon tax is an interesting one. Most consumers don't know how much carbon is used in the production of the products they want. So if there's a good carbon tax, and particularly the most successful ones, apparently, the money that is collected, the funds that are collected in the carbon tax are returned to the population. That's an interesting approach, and people like getting monies. So the carbon tax makes things more expensive, but then they get money back. And yeah, other traffic lights and other traffic control systems I spoke about. You have libel and fraud control systems. Again, libel and fraud, if people are speaking truthfully all the time, you don't need libel and fraud control systems. People will control their own desire to hide and misrepresent information. And then when there are unjust laws, part of creating the properly constrained liberty is that when there are unjust laws, unfair laws, that various kinds of nonviolent action can be used to protest and change those laws. And within the nonviolent movements, the fact they are nonviolent is constraint. There's lots of things to do to change things, to influence people without the use of violence. And so the fact that you are constraining yourself to be nonviolent and using maximum creativity and moral pressure within that constraint is another example of freedom within boundaries. And then you have processes, group processes. It's like circle process. People are taking turns talking, and when they have the talking stick, they have the full freedom to speak. Nobody's going to interrupt them. It's sort of like the traffic light. But when they don't have the talking stick, their responsibility is to listen. And brainstorming, also in brainstorming, you create wild ideas in response to a question. But you're not supposed to critique any ideas. The critiquing is left for later. The evaluation and judgment is left for later. All we're doing now is creating. And that creative dynamic feeds on itself, and the people in the group start being more wild and creative in their creativity, which gets shut down if there's judgment. So that's another constraint that supports freedom. And of course, sports and games are the archetypal, here are specific constraints. You behave this way, you do this. This is what the point is. You're not gonna go running off the field into the bleachers with your football. You may be able to avoid the other players, but you're not gonna get your touchdown that way.